Scott Anderson was 29 years old when he found his father slumped over the wheel of a John Deere 40 Priority, dead from a heart attack in the middle of wheat harvest. It was October 1989, Riley County, Kansas, the kind of Tuesday that starts normal and ends with your entire world rearranged. Ray Anderson had farmed that land since 1950, built it from a single quarter section to 1,100 acres of wheat and milo. Solid ground, good operation, the kind of legacy that should have carried another generation. Should have. Scott buried his father on Friday. By Monday morning, he was sitting across from Dennis Kohler at Farmer State Bank, learning what he'd actually inherited, and that's when the first bomb dropped. "Your father's estate totals about $1, $2 million, Dennis said, sliding a paper across the desk. Scott nodded. He'd expected that. The land, the equipment, 40 years of work. Then Dennis slid another sheet. Total debt, $734,000. Scott's stomach dropped. His father had always said the farm was clear, paid off back in the 70s. Dennis leaned back with the weary face of a man who'd watched the farm crisis destroy good people. He did pay it off. In 1979, then land prices exploded, and your father did what everyone did, leveraged the equity to expand. Bought the Morrison section in 1980, new equipment, grain bins. By 81, he was in for $400,000. But that was 13 years ago, Scott said. Then the bottom fell out. The farm crisis of the 80s. Scott knew about it, but he didn't know his father had barely survived it. The restructure in 86, the extended terms, the land that was worth $800 per acre in 1981, but only $500 in 1989. The debt stayed the same. The interest ate Ray alive. He'd paid some down, but not enough. Never enough. Net equity, $466,000. It sounded like fortune. It wasn't enough to farm. Scott asked if he could keep operating. Dennis hesitated. That hesitation was the answer. The estate loan comes due in 90 days unless we restructure. And you've only been helping your dad for 5 years. No credit history as a principal operator. The bank will probably approve $50,000, maybe $60,000 for operating. You're going to be tight. Real tight. Scott drove home in his father's 1985 Ford F-250, still smelling of diesel and cherry tobacco. His mother Louise waited on the porch, smaller somehow, the way farms make widows smaller. "We can keep it," Scott told her, "but it's tight." She nodded. She didn't ask how tight. She didn't want to know. That winter, Scott learned what tight meant. He cut every expense, did his own mechanic work, bought used parts. He and his wife Jennifer moved into the old farmhouse with his mother to save money. Jennifer's teaching salary became their only steady income. Scott took a part-time job at the co-op. In February 1990, he sat down with the books. The 1989 harvest had been decent. After expenses, he'd cleared $45,000. The land payment was $52,000 annually. He did the math forward. Average yields, average prices. He could make the payment and maybe pay down $10,000 or $15,000 of principal per year. In 30 years, at age 62, he'd have it paid off. It didn't seem impossible, just hard. But there's a difference between hard and impossible, and sometimes you don't know which one you're facing until it's way too late. Spring 1990 came late. Scott got the crops in, worked the ground, then the equipment started breaking. The 4440 threw a hydraulic pump, $1,800. The combine needed feeder chains, $600. The grain truck blew a transmission, and $2,200. Every time he turned around, something else shattered. In July, Jennifer told him she was pregnant, their first child, due February. Scott hugged her and told her it was wonderful. It was, and it was absolutely terrifying because his operating loan was already maxed and harvest was still 2 months out. The wheat harvest came in 10 bushels below county average. Late spring had hurt them. Prices dropped to $2.85. Scott did the math in the grain truck while hauling to the elevator. He was going to come up short. Way short. By October, after the Milo was in, he sat across from Dennis again. "I need to extend the operating note." Dennis looked at the balance. $47,000. "Scott, your debt-to-asset ratio is already at 62%. That's the high end. If I extend this again, you're at 67. I can't justify that. What am I supposed to do? Sell some equipment or find another income source, or both?" Scott walked through the equipment shed that night. What could he sell? The old 4020 was only worth $8,000, and he needed it. The grain trucks were essential. The only thing worth real money was the 7720 combine at maybe $35,000. But if he sold it, he'd have to hire custom cutting. That would eat the savings in 3 years. He didn't sell anything. He borrowed $5,000 from his uncle, put $3,000 on a credit card. His daughter Amy was born in February 1991. Scott held her in the hospital and tried not to think about the $4,800 bill they couldn't afford. The 1991 crop year was better. Good rains, decent prices. He cleared $58,000, paid the land payment, knocked the operating loan down to $38,000. For the first time in 2 years, Scott thought maybe they'd make it. Then his mother got sick. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in August. By November, she was in hospice. She died 3 days after Christmas. Scott buried her next to his father. He was 30 years old, both parents gone in 2 years. The farm felt emptier than it ever had. Louise's medical bills came to $23,000 that insurance didn't cover. Scott added them to the operating loan. The bank agreed reluctantly. His debt-to-asset ratio hit 70%. In March 1992, the Federal Land Bank called in notes on high-risk accounts. Scott's account was flagged. He met with Dennis again. This time, Dennis brought his supervisor. "Scott, I'm going to be direct. The bank can't carry you anymore. Your debt service is eating all your operating income. You're not paying down principal. One bad year and you're under. I had a good year last year. You had an average year. You need 3 or 4 years in a row of above-average yields and above-average prices just to stabilize. That's not a business plan. That's hope." Scott felt something crack inside him, something that had been holding for 2.5 years. "What do you want me to do?" "Sell, before you're forced to. While you still have equity, walk away with something rather than nothing." "This is my father's farm." "I know, but your father built it during the best years agriculture ever had. Land values went up every year. That's over, Scott. The economics changed. You inherited at the worst possible time. That's not your fault, but it's reality." Scott left the meeting and drove to the Morrison place his father had bought in 1980. He walked into the wheat field. Early March, green shoots pushing through Kansas clay. He stood there trying to figure out what his father would do. But his father had never been in this position. Ray had started with nothing and built everything. Scott started with everything and was losing it. Different problems, different solutions he didn't know. That night at the kitchen table, Jennifer asked what if they sold half? "Could you make 900 acres work? The debt is secured by all 1,900. I can't sell half without paying off the note. And the note is $650,000. I can't get that for 900 acres. What if you lease it out? Cash rent won't cover the land payment." Jennifer was quiet. Then she said what they'd both been avoiding. "What if we just stop, walk away? You could get a job. We could move to town, start over." Scott looked at his wife of 5 years, the mother of his daughter, the woman who'd never complained while he poured everything into keeping the farm alive. "I can't. Not yet." But even as he said it, he knew the truth. He was going to lose it. The only question was how much longer he could delay it and how much more debt he'd accumulate before admitting defeat. The 1992 crop year was average, 40 bushels of wheat. He cleared $52,000. The land payment was $52,000. He paid it, rolled the operating loan over again. Now, $43,000. The equipment was dying. The 4440 needed an engine overhaul, $5,800. He put it off. The combine had a cracked rasp bar. He welded it. It held, barely. In November, Jennifer got pregnant again. Their son Tyler was born in July 1993. Scott missed the birth because he was swathing wheat. He made it to the hospital 2 hours after Tyler arrived. He held his son and cried. Not from joy, though there was joy, but from exhaustion, from the weight of trying to keep everything together, from knowing he was failing. The 1993 harvest was bad, drought across Kansas. Scott's wheat came in at 28 bushels per acre. Milo was worse. Prices dropped to $2.60. By October, he cleared $31,000. The land payment was $52,000. For the first time in Ray Anderson's 40 years of farming, and Anderson couldn't make the land payment. Scott called Dennis. Dennis didn't answer. His voicemail said to contact collections. Scott drove to Manhattan, walked into the bank, sat down with a woman he'd never met. Carol Fisher, Federal Land Bank Regional Office. She had Scott's file open. Mr. Anderson, your loan is in default. You've missed the November payment. Your equity position is now below 50%. We're required to initiate foreclosure proceedings. I just need more time. Mr. Anderson, I've reviewed your account. You've operated at a loss or break even for 4 years. Your debt has increased 20% since you took over. This isn't working. The bank needs to recover its position before you're completely underwater. What happens now? You have 90 days to bring the account current or arrange a sale. If you can't, we'll file for foreclosure and arrange a public auction. Scott went home and looked at the numbers. He owed $687,000. The farm was probably worth $850,000 if you could find a buyer in a market where nobody had money. That night, Carl Wesson knocked on the door. Carl was 61, farmed the section west of the Anderson place since 1964. He'd been through the farm crisis too. He'd survived. Some people did. I heard you're in a tight spot, Carl said. They stood in the kitchen. Jennifer had taken the kids upstairs. I'm going to make you an offer. I'll buy the operation, all of it. Pay enough to clear your debt. You walk away clean. No bankruptcy, no foreclosure. How much? $320,000. The number hit Scott like a fist. The farm is worth $850,000. The farm is worth what someone will pay. And right now, nobody around here has $850,000. I do. Because I made different choices during the 80s than your father did. What choices? Carl sat down, uninvited. He looked tired. When land prices crashed, I sold. I owned 1,400 acres in 1982. By 1987, I owned 600. I sold at the bottom. Took a bath. Paid off my debt. Started over small. Rented ground for 5 years. Rebuilt equipment slowly. Paid cash. By 1992, I was clear. No debt. When your father was making $50,000 land payments, I was paying $0. That's how I survived. I gave up land to save the farm. My father didn't give up. I know. I respected him for it, but respect doesn't pay bills. Your father fought the crisis and won. Barely. But he was 63 when he died. He didn't have time to recover. You inherited his victory, but you also inherited his debt. And that debt is going to kill you if you don't let go. Carl stood up, put an envelope on the table. Written offer, good for 30 days. I know it's not what you want, but it's better than foreclosure. After Carl left, Scott opened the envelope. $320,000. Closing within 60 days. Carl would assume all debt. Scott would walk away with nothing but freedom. Jennifer came downstairs. Scott showed her the offer. She read it twice. Are you going to take it? I don't know. Scott, we're drowning. This is a life preserver. It's pennies. $320,000 for 1,900 acres. That's less than 200 an acre. In 1980, it was worth 800. But it's not 1980. And we're not your father. And we have 2 kids who need to eat. Scott put his head in his hands. 40 years of work, gone in 5. Because he couldn't make it work. Because he wasn't good enough. Because he'd inherited at the wrong time. Because the economics had changed. Because he was young and inexperienced and undercapitalized. Because of all of it. None of it. It didn't matter. The result was the same. What would your father want? Jennifer asked. Scott thought about that. Would Ray Anderson want his son to fight until there was nothing left? Would he want his grandchildren raised in poverty while Scott clung to dirt and debt? Or would he want his son to survive? Scott realized he didn't know. His father had never been tested like this. His father had fought battles and won. Scott was fighting battles and losing. Different calculations. In January 1994, Scott called Carl Wesson and accepted the offer. The sale closed in March. Scott signed papers for 6 hours. When it was over, he walked out with nothing. Carl owned everything. 1,900 acres, the house, the equipment, everything Ray Anderson had built across 40 years. The bank got $687,000. Carl got a farm. Scott got nothing except the absence of debt. He and Jennifer and the kids moved to Manhattan, rented a small house. Scott got a job at the Case IH dealership. Service technician, $43,000 a year. Benefits, steady hours. No stress about whether the wheat would come in or the combine would break. He drove past the farm sometimes, saw Carl's equipment, saw wheat coming up, saw the house where he'd grown up. It wasn't his anymore. But here's where the story takes a turn nobody expected. By 2000, Scott had paid off his consumer debt and saved a down payment. He bought 40 acres, not farming commercially, but he was on land again. He raised horses, taught his kids to ride. Jennifer got her master's degree, became a school principal. They built a good life, different than he'd imagined, but good. Carl Wesson farmed the Anderson place until he retired in 2008. Then he sold it to a corporate operation for $4. $2 million. The 1,900 acres that Scott lost for $320,000 sold for $4. $2 million 14 years later. $2,200 per acre. Carl's heirs inherited that money. Scott's kids inherited a small acreage and a father who wasn't broken by debt. Here's what matters. Scott made mistakes. He held on too long. He let pride override economics. But those aren't moral failures. Those are human failures, and the difference matters. Ray Anderson built a farm during the greatest agricultural expansion in American history. From 1952 to 1979, land values went up almost every year. Ray made good decisions during good times. That doesn't make him a hero. That makes him lucky. Scott inherited during the worst agricultural contraction since the Great Depression. He made decent decisions during terrible times. That doesn't make him a failure. That makes him unlucky. The lesson isn't about farming. It's about timing. It's about knowing when you're fighting economics and when you're fighting reality. Scott was fighting both. Nobody wins that fight. Sometimes the right decision looks like failure. Scott felt like he'd failed his father, failed the land, failed 3 generations. But he hadn't. He'd done what his father never had to do. He'd made the choice between pride and survival, between heritage and future. He chose his family. That's not failure, that's wisdom. Carl Wesson isn't a villain here. The economics are the villain. Carl made hard choices in the 80s. He sold land at the bottom, lost equity, swallowed his pride, started over small. Those choices positioned him to survive and eventually expand. When Carl bought Scott's farm for $320,000, he wasn't stealing it. He was buying what Scott couldn't afford to keep. Was it fair? No. Is it fair that some farmers entered the crisis with low debt and some with high debt? Is it fair that some inherited during expansions and some during contractions? None of it's fair, but fairness isn't the measure. Survival is. Agricultural economists will tell you farm operations that entered the post-crisis period with debt-to-asset ratios above 60% had failure rates exceeding 40% within 5 years. Operations with ratios below 40% had failure rates under 10%. The debt level mattered more than management skill, more than weather, more than prices. If you were over-leveraged in 1989, you were probably gone by 1995. That's not judgment. That's statistics. Scott was over-leveraged. He never had a chance. Not really. He could have been the best farmer in Kansas and it wouldn't have mattered. The math didn't work. The equity wasn't there. The timing was wrong. And here's the final lesson. There is no shame in walking away from something you can't save. There's no honor in destroying yourself trying to preserve what's already lost. And there's profound wisdom in knowing the difference. Scott Anderson lost his father's farm, but he saved his family. He saved himself. He found another path. And 30 years later, when his kids were grown and his grandkids were being born, nobody asked him about the 1,900 acres he lost. They asked him about the life he built after. Because that's what matters. Not what you inherit, not what you lose, but what you do with what comes after. If you're watching this and you've lost something, a farm, a business, a dream, hear this. The loss doesn't define you. The recovery does. Scott spent 5 years trying to keep his father's farm. He spent 30 years building his own life. Guess which one his kids remember? The farm crisis created a generation of men who measured themselves by land they no longer owned. Men who defined success by acreage and equipment. Men who felt like failures because they couldn't hold on to something that was never really holdable. The economics had changed. The world had changed. And no amount of work or will or sacrifice could change that. Scott figured that out in 1994. It took him 5 years and $687,000 in debt and the loss of everything his father built. But he figured it out. He walked away. He survived. That's not the ending anyone wants, but it's the ending a lot of people got. And there's something to be said for making peace with it, for accepting it, for recognizing that sometimes the best you can do is survive with your dignity intact. Scott did that. He lost the land, but kept himself. And in the end, that's the only thing you really own anyway. If you have a story like this, if you lost land or watched someone lose it or made the choice to walk away, share it in the comments. A lot of people need to hear they're not alone, that the loss wasn't failure, that survival counts for something. And if you believe these stories deserve to be told, the ones about the people who lost, not just the ones who won, then don't forget to subscribe. Share this. Help me reach the people who need to hear it. Because this history matters, not because it's triumphant, but because it's true. Scott Anderson's story ends in Manhattan, Kansas in 1994 in a rented house with 2 kids and a wife and a job that pays by the hour. It's not the story his father lived. It's not the story Scott imagined. But it's the story he got, and he made something from it anyway. Sometimes that's all you can do, and sometimes that's enough.